I'm Barry Bergdoll, Curator of Architecture and Design here at MoMA, together with
Patricio del Real, Curatorial Assistant here at MoMA also, and we're with Ann Pendleton, who participated in, who's, well, first of all, he said architect, practitioner, also teacher of architecture, and also has been involved with Chile and the Catholic University of Valparaiso for a long time, I guess.
28 years
For
now.
28 years.
Yeah. The open city is an impressive thing when you understand that almost all of it is built by the professors and the students, and there are projects that we're missing already because they're not interested that they stay forever. They're interested in the making of the project.
what captured you?
Well,
What was the spark that you so instantly reconnected?
the way they operate, all of the work is important as a process more than actually the finished project. And I think I had a propensity for poetry, and John Haydick was a good friend of mine. I mean, all these are all connections that seem to be very much part of my inner nature, if you will. And all of the buildings have stories. Every single one of them. They're done communally. That's interesting. That's less interesting to me because I do feel often the best work is single authorship, but they had a methodology whereby it became a single communal authorship. They used poetic acts that were directly taken from the Surrealist methodologies, card games, games on the beach, Olympics, performances. And so they were, the buildings all had stories.
When you say a building has a story, do you mean it has a backstory, or do you mean that the building itself, in a John Haydick way, is telling a story?
Their whole idea was that poetry is a vehicle to move from kind of story as an inner need to actual physical form, where you don't need a libretto to understand what the architect's backstory. So much, you know, I was at Cornell and then Princeton studying, and so many buildings of the people I even admire, you need to read what they say in terms of what they were reading and what they were thinking. You know, I take a lot from Peter Eisenman, but the buildings don't always directly mesh, or they do, but you have to read what it's about. These, all of them, you sense completely. If you can't write the story down yourself, at least you have a tremendous sense of what they were after. And it was really, it's all about the site. It's about the fluidity of the site. It's about the movement of the sand. It's about the sound of the wind. And ultimately, their big project, if you will, was to really try to understand what is an authentic Latin American heritage, when much of Latin American culture, South American, I'll actually leave in South America because South and Central and the islands are all really, really different. Much South American culture is very nostalgic. And that nostalgia has kept often the culture for finding a true authentic starting point, which is what they did. They have an entire foundational poem that they wrote that got them started. Then they created a methodology to literally take that poem and put it on the ground and travel through South America to doing these poetic acts to discover the country. So yes, they are both visceral and poetic.
I guess this notion of the observación, the observation, that is very much related to the pedagogical structure of the school. But it's also, I would argue, it's also related very much to Valparaiso. The city of Valparaiso, the school cannot live without the city.
Absolutely.
Right? And this is almost a complete organic sort of mesh between the school and Valparaiso. Can you elaborate on
Absolutely.
that? Or?
I mean, the city was their laboratory.
Sure.
You know, the idea is that every act is in the world, and the city they had. And when I first went to the open city, I was so impressed by the ad hocism, meaning you build what you need when you need it. But that's Valparaiso. Yeah. I mean, the formal city, the flat city, has got the whole law of the Indies laid down on it. But many of the buildings have fallen down because of the earthquake. But the hills, and what's really interesting about Valparaiso, unlike, for instance, the favelas in Rio, which I love, the first hills in Valparaiso were actually settled by people with money, by Europeans. So they were planned as much as you could plan on that slope. So the top of the hills, which are small areas, have a structure. There's always a mirador, and there's the funiculars that go down, and then there's the staircases that go down, and then there's the staircases that do this, and then there's the roads that go up. So there's a real structure as a thematic structure. But then you get onto the slopes, and it's all ad hoc. So, Jullian was born in Valparaiso, and I've seen the house of his grandmother that's fallen down. And he just, he lived the city. I loved Valparaiso. I couldn't get enough of it. I photographed it extensively. His family could not understand why I would be so interested in a slum city. And there were really difficult parts still there. The port is still very difficult. And so the idea that you would observe, and the first year project they did, the first year, was really interesting. They sent all of the students out with a photograph of a building in Valparaiso. Have you heard this story?
I've heard this story. It's amazing.
This is so amazing. So they send them out, and all you have to do for the whole semester is find that building and document it. And then now, of course, it wasn't the obvious buildings. It was something somewhere. But you could begin to understand the city and use the logic of the city. Was it at the top of the slope? Was it at the bottom of the slope? Where was, But the whole point was that not all the students would come back. Some of them would decide they wanted, as they documented it, they were documenting the sounds or the birds. And he had classmates that became musicians, that went off to become mathematicians, that went into all these other fields because the city had taught them such an astounding lesson. So, yeah, it's pretty cool.
But I think that's interesting that it implies already that the buildings that are there have a story, and that you're being taught to read the story in the photograph that you're given that is going to, if I understand you correctly, is going to limit where you're going to go looking for this lost object or this unknown object. So you're already developing a profound relationship between the physiognomy of a building and the physiognomy of a site that then seems in turn to be so much a part of the traversias and of the the open city itself, which is an ad hoc, ongoing work of landscape art, really.
And you're 100% right. So there's the ad hocism, there's the stories, but there's the themes as well. So so a lot of my work now deals with complex systems. So I went from astrophysics to architecture, but I work on universities now. I'm actually working in higher ed, designing new models. I'm working in complex systems. I loved Valparaiso because you have a little bit of a top-down structure. Somebody did draw plans a little bit. But then you have some basic principles for occupying the hills, which we could call these themes. But then you have meta-themes, and then you have the individual variability of each hill and the variability of each house. So it's this incredible palette.
There are many conditions that enable the Valparaiso school, right? One is the territory of Chile, which is local geografía, which kind of sustains this kind of examination of geography and inhabitation. Right? The other one is Chile, país de poetas. Right? To be a poet. This is one of my first shocks being in Chile. Is like people would come and you ask her what do you do? So, I'm a poet. And you would say, okay, well, you're not being serious. He said, no, this is serious. And the level of respect that there's still in Chile, a social respect for poets, it's I think quite unique, if not in the world, certainly for Latin America. But also, I think it was also this condition between ad hoc, poverty, and the difficulty of inhabiting. Right, that it's always, and Chile has always considered themselves, Chileans have considered the country as a poor country. So now, even though there's still many issues around poverty and development in Chile, it's hard to imagine Chile as being truly a poor country.
Well, it's really kind of Switzerland of
so and even though they still to this day say no, we're still poor, we're still poor. Well, when you go to Chile, and you see the massive infrastructure that there is. So how do you see this affecting sort of the development of the future of the open city or the Valparaiso project?
I don't know. If you had asked me this period, about 8 years when I wasn't going back, if you'd asked me, I would have said the experiment is over. In fact, I did. They were beginning to quote themselves architecturally. The words were kind of hollow, but then it rejuvenated itself. And so I really don't know. I mean, Chile will always, I mean, even the architects, which I'll talk about, like Aravena and others that are becoming superstars, but they're still very Chilean because the boundary conditions in Chile are still very, very concise. So I don't know.